The photograph taken from the Landsat satellite in 1975 shows nothing the official record would ask you to examine twice. A river basin, forest canopy extending to the frame's edge in every direction. The green is unbroken, dense, layered in the way that primary tropical forest presents from altitude, a surface so uniform it reads as geological fact. That was the accepted interpretation of the Amazon for most of the 20th century. An ancient wilderness, ecologically complex, humanly marginal. A place where civilization had never established itself because the soil was too poor, the terrain too wet, and the forest too hostile to the kind of sustained agricultural and architectural effort that produces cities and roads, and the geometric regularity that marks a landscape organized by human design. That interpretation rested on something real. The soils of the central Amazon basin are, in the standard geological description, among the least productive in the world for sustained agriculture, lateritic, heavily leached, stripped of nutrients by millions of years of rainfall. This is accurate. It was the foundation on which a generation of researchers built the argument that pre-Columbian Amazonian populations were necessarily small, mobile, and incapable of producing landscape-scale organization. The foundation was accurate. What it failed to account for was the possibility that the soil had been changed. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. In the 1980s, a Brazilian agronomist named Wim Sombroek began publishing systematic analysis of a soil type appearing in deposits distributed across the Amazon basin. He was not the first to notice it. The German geologist Carl von den Steinen had recorded the anomaly in field notes from the 1880s, notes that the mainstream literature absorbed and filed without follow-up. What Sombroek did was build an argument from distribution. The soil he examined was dark, carbon-rich, extraordinarily fertile in a basin where fertility was structurally supposed to be impossible. It appeared near rivers. It appeared in locations corresponding to no volcanic or geological process that would produce it naturally. Mapped across the basin with the attention Sombroek brought to the data, it appeared in a pattern, not the random scatter of a natural deposit, a pattern consistent with sustained human occupation across long periods at specific sites selected with deliberate care. The soil had a name in Portuguese, Terra Preta, dark earth. What Sombroek's analysis established was that it was anthropogenic, created by human activity over generations through the controlled addition of charcoal, bone, and organic material to the underlying lateritic substrate. Someone had engineered the soil, not in one location, not as an isolated agricultural experiment, but across hundreds of identified sites distributed through millions of square kilometers of basin. The sites followed the river systems with a specificity that natural deposition cannot produce. Whoever made this soil had been in the basin long enough and in sufficient numbers to alter its chemistry at a scale that has no comparable pre-industrial precedent in the documented record. The mainstream response when Sombroek's work began accumulating confirmation in the 1990s was cautious. The accepted framework for Amazonian prehistory, built over decades by researchers including the American archaeologist Betty Meggers, held that the basin's ecological limits had kept human populations small and semi-nomadic. Meggers had published her central argument in 1971 under the title Amazonia, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise. The counterfeit in her framing was the forest's apparent abundance, which she argued concealed a nutrient poverty that made complex civilization impossible. Her argument was accepted broadly because it was coherent, and because the evidence that would qualify it had not yet been recovered from beneath the canopy. The canopy is the element that governed the entire history of this investigation. The Amazon's forest cover is so dense, so complete from above, that what lies beneath it was functionally invisible to every remote sensing technology deployed before the development of airborne LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a laser-based system capable of penetrating canopy cover and returning a precise three-dimensional map of the ground surface below. The technology existed in early form by the 1990s. Its systematic application to the Amazon basin at the resolution required to recover built features from beneath primary forest cover began in earnest in the 2000s. What it produced, site after site, was a record the existing framework had no ready category for. What the LiDAR returns showed across the Brazilian states of Acre, Mato Grosso, and Amazonas, and across the Bolivian Beni, was geometry, not the irregular contours of a natural landscape shaped by water and erosion, but precise angles, consistent measurements, repeated forms, ditches cut to uniform depth and width, earthen embankments rising to consistent heights, enclosures whose interior dimensions corresponded to each other across distances of hundreds of kilometers in ways that natural formation cannot produce. Causeways running straight between elevated platforms in landscapes where straight lines do not occur without the application of sustained human labor directed by a plan. The researchers used the word earthworks in their published papers. The popular literature eventually reached for geoglyphs. What the assembled LiDAR data showed when the surveys from multiple areas were laid against each other was something that neither word captures. What it showed was a grid. The grid had been there the entire time, under the canopy, under the rain, under 2 centuries of scientific consensus that said this basin could not have supported what the LiDAR was now showing it had supported. The question the data placed before the field, and before anyone who looked at the maps, was not whether a complex civilization had organized the Amazon basin before European contact. The LiDAR had answered that. The question was what had happened to it, when and why the record of its existence had taken this long to surface. The grid was first described in terms the field could not immediately dismiss in 2003, when the American anthropologist Michael Heckenberger published a study in Science examining a cluster of sites in the upper Xingu region of the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. Heckenberger had been working with the Cuicuro people of the Xingu for years before the published account appeared. What the excavation and survey data showed was not a scattering of isolated villages. It was a network, 20 settlements arranged across the landscape with a spatial logic that the word arrangement does not fully convey. The villages were connected by roads, the roads ran straight. The plazas at the center of each settlement were oriented to cardinal directions with a consistency that random placement cannot produce. The central settlements in the network were larger, positioned at the hub of radiating paths that connected to smaller satellite communities at distances following a repeating geometric ratio. Heckenberger's term for what he had found was a galactic cluster. What the data described was urban planning. The Xingu network was not small. Heckenberger estimated the system had supported a population in the tens of thousands at its height, sometime between the 12th and 15th centuries. The road infrastructure connecting its nodes ran for dozens of kilometers through terrain that required sustained organized labor to maintain. The plazas were not simply cleared ground, they were leveled, bordered, and in several cases aligned to astronomical events in ways that the Cuicuro oral tradition had preserved across generations, without the wider academic literature registering what the tradition was preserving. The knowledge had not been lost. It had simply been recorded in a language that the researchers arriving from outside had not thought to read. The Bolivian Beni presents a different category of evidence, more recent and harder to absorb gradually. In 2022, a team led by the German archaeologist Heiko Prumers published LiDAR survey results in Nature covering a region of the Bolivian lowlands associated with the Casarabe culture, a civilization occupying the area between approximately 500 and 1400 of the Common Era. What the survey returned was a settlement system of a scale that the summary literature is still catching up to. 2 large urban centers, the sites designated Kotoka and Landivar, covering areas of 147 and 315 hectares respectively, connected by a network of straight elevated causeways running up to 24 kilometers between nodes. Smaller settlements distributed across the survey area followed the same geometric logic as the Xingu network. Central larger sites, satellite communities at consistent distances, Roads running between them at angles that reflect deliberate survey rather than the accumulated paths of foot traffic over generations. Foot traffic curves. These roads do not curve. The causeways in the Beni are raised above the surrounding savanna by a consistent elevation. They drain correctly. They handle the seasonal flooding of the Bolivian lowlands in a way that requires understanding the hydrology of the region across years, not seasons. Whoever designed them had watched this landscape through enough flood cycles to know where the water went and how long it stayed. That is generational knowledge encoded in civil engineering. The causeways are still there. Farmers in the Beni have been moving along them for generations without the infrastructure that produced them appearing in any account of the region's pre-contact history that the mainstream literature treated as credible. The question of why the mainstream literature took this long to register what was there has an answer that the evidentiary record makes available, though the official history of Amazonian research has not assembled it into a single frame. The answer begins on the 26th of August, 1541, when a Spanish expedition under Francisco de Orellana departed from Quito and descended into the Amazon basin. Orellana's chronicler, the Dominican friar Gaspar de Carvajal, kept a detailed record of what the expedition encountered as it moved down the river over the following months. Carvajal's account describes large settlements along the riverbanks, populations dense enough that the expedition traveled for days through continuously occupied territory, roads leading into the interior, and a community the chronicle calls a city, large enough, Carvajal wrote, that the expedition did not dare to land. The account was read by subsequent generations and filed under exaggeration. The friar was assumed to have inflated what he saw, motivated by the same appetite for legend that drove the El Dorado narrative circulating through Spanish colonial culture. His account was not lost, it was available. It was simply assigned to a category that exempted it from being taken as evidence. The dismissal was not without institutional support. Betty Mega's 1971 argument gave academic cover to an interpretation that the Carvajal account had already been waiting to receive. If the Amazon could not support complex civilization, then what Carvajal described could not have been there. The logic ran in both directions, each proposition reinforcing the other, producing a closed evidentiary circle that the Terra Preta data and the LiDAR surveys have now broken open from the outside. Mega's argument was coherent given the data available to her. What the subsequent decades produced was data she did not have. What neither Megas nor the researchers who followed her addressed was the timeline. The Great Dying, the collapse of indigenous American populations following European contact, driven by epidemic disease moving ahead of sustained European exploration, is estimated by contemporary demographic researchers to have killed between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact population of the Americas within a century of first contact. In the Amazon basin, that collapse preceded any systematic European investigation of the interior. By the time naturalists and explorers began documenting the region with scientific rigor in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were reading a landscape that had been largely emptied of its human population for 200 years. The forest had moved back in. The earthworks had silted over. The roads had been reclaimed. What they saw, and what they described, was a wilderness. What they were actually looking at was an aftermath. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. The Terra Preta is still there. Farmers in the Brazilian state of Pará have known for generations that certain patches of ground produce harvests that the surrounding lateritic soil cannot match. They call the dark deposits black gold. They have been planting in them without knowing or without needing to know that the fertility beneath their tools was placed there by a civilization the written record spent 2 centuries arguing could not have existed. The soil did not require the argument to be settled. It simply remained, holding its carbon, holding its nutrients, holding its evidence in the one medium that 400 years of forest and flood and academic consensus could not revise. The earthworks in Acre are being documented at a rate that the research teams cannot match. Each dry season, as cattle ranchers clear additional forest for pasture, New geometric forms emerge from beneath the canopy, circles, squares, hexagons, some reaching 300 meters across. They are not being discovered, they are being uncovered. The distinction is precise. These structures were known by the people who built them, used by the people who inherited them, and visible to anyone who looked at the cleared ground. What changed was not the existence of the evidence. What changed was the willingness of the field to treat the evidence as evidence. Return to the Landsat image from 1975. The green is still unbroken from altitude. The basin still reads as silence. Nothing in the frame announces what the ground beneath the canopy contains. The raised causeways of the Beni running straight for 24 kilometers. The galactic road network of the Xingu oriented to cardinal points, the dark soil deposits marking site after site where tens of thousands of people lived and farmed and built. The satellite saw a wilderness, the LiDAR saw a city. The difference between those two readings is not a matter of technology, it is a matter of what a given period was prepared to find. The grid was always underneath, the soil was always altered. The roads were always there for anyone who knew what a road looked like when the forest had been given 2 centuries to cover it. The record did not disappear, it waited. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.